Hello everyone, this is Janie Hill, and for my presentation I'll be doing a collection development on the science fiction and fantasy for the Waiawa Correctional Facility Library um, in the state of Hawaii. So the Correctional Library is in the state of Hawaii that provides legal and recreational reading and research materials for inmates. It is classified as a special library with a focused population of adult male inmates in a minimum security facility. The objective of the collection development was to increase science fiction and fantasy genres in print books for WCF. Computers, internet, and tablets are prohibited for inmates, but can be used by librarians for purposes that do not involve inmates. The library at WCF is roughly about 1,500 square feet. It's a single room with a collection of roughly 2,600 fiction and non-fiction fiction books, a number of legal volumes such as the Hawaiian Revised Statutes, United States Code, Federal and Pacific Reporter, various ligation guides and manuals, and a LexisNexis legal touchscreen kiosk. The library serves both the recreational book needs of inmates, which is considered a privilege, as well as provides access to court documents and other legal material, which is a constitutional protected right afforded to those incarcerated in the state of Hawaii. So why have recreational books in prison libraries? Recreational reading reduces stress caused by incarceration, and studies have shown that giving inmates books to read induces a humanizing effect and reduces recidivism by more than half. Moreover, leisure reading is the primary source of entertainment for inmates. Hawaii states that the average inmate uses their correctional library more frequently than most people who visit a public library, and they read up to 10 times more than that of an average person not incarcerated. I know this source is outdated. It was from 1986, um, but it shows the amount of reading that was, and it would be interesting to do another report to see what the reading levels are and compare it to people that are not in prison. So for my selection and weeding tools, I have three major tools that I have chosen. The Department of Public Safety Policy and Procedure, Core 1505, which is inmate access to publications. The Department of Public Safety Policy and Procedure, Core 1416, which is library services. And Barnes & Noble's, the website. And I'll get into that, why Barnes & Noble is part of my tool later in the presentation. So the fiction collection is contained on 10 shelves, of which only 2 house the science fiction and fantasy books. There are approximately 120 science fiction books and about 60 fantasy books in the library at a given time, with about 15 to 20% of all recreational books checked out, another 15 to 25 science fiction books in circulation. The highest volume of checkouts also occur on Mondays and Fridays, and the reason this is because inmates want reading material for the full week, so they'll check out books on Mondays, and then they also want reading material for the weekend because the library is closed, so they will check out books on Fridays as well. And some more statistics that were provided by the WCF librarian was that on average in a month, the library sees about 300 to 400 checkouts, which averages between 10 to 13 checkouts per day, of which the bulk of these checkouts are science fiction and fantasy, which equals to about 50% of the actual percentage of checkouts in a month, which is a very high number when you think about the amount of books being checked out. 50% is science fiction or fantasy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about censorship because it does heavily affect the selection process when choosing material for the collection development for this facility. So the ALA states that libraries are an open exchange of information, and any attempt to restrict access to information as long as it is lawful as a challenge to the United States Liberty Bill of Rights. However, in a correctional environment, when it comes to selecting books, regardless of the decisions of the librarian and library director, the warden and deputy warden have the absolute authority at each facility, and they can overrule any library decision and so have the final say. So the selection policy. The Hawaiian Department of Public Safety Correctional Policy Number Core 1505 states that inmates shall have access to publications that do not advocate overt violence of subversive action that is contrary to law, departmental rules and safety, security and health of persons, and the good government of the Public Safety Department. What does this policy actually mean? Here's a list of the strict guidelines enforced at WCF, which falls under Core 1505 and Core 1416, which kind of breaks it down even more. So number 1, material advocating, advertising, or facilitating any criminal activity, including escape, physical harm, death to another person, incest, pedophilia, forced sex, robbery, and burglary. Material which contains instructions on construction or use of weapons, ammunition, bombs or explosives, incendiary devices, handguns or rifles. Material describing procedures for brewing alcohol beverages or making cultivating drugs or poisons. Material that glorifies drug use is prohibited as well. Materials advocating sadomasochism, activity, bestiality, group sex, pedophilia, or incest. Material that is prejudiced or racist in nature, advocates that any ethnic, racial, or religious group is inferior. Material that advocates the overthrow of government, either the U.S. as a whole or the state of Hawaii. Material containing subject matter that has an adverse impact on rehabilitation of inmates or management of institutional security. Material that depicts or encourages escape from institutions. Material that is written in code. Material that may encourage activities that may lead to physical violence or disruption. Or any material that instructs in the commission of criminal activity. So number 7, 8, 9, and 10, and 11 are a bit vague, so it's often left at the discretion of the librarian and director. However, as I mentioned before, if the warden or deputy warden feels that a book falls under any one of these rules, then they can order the book removed from the shelf. As is the case, WCF had a copy of Mein Kampf, which is an autobiography of Adolf Hitler, and it was removed at the request of the warden, as it was believed it falls under numbers 5 and 10. So in an interview with the WCF librarian, the most requested items from inmates fall under these categories that I have summed up. And assuming that all titles are appropriate as outlined in Core 1416 that I had mentioned in the slide before, the collection development should include the following science fiction and fantasy subgenres: alternate history, alien invasion, dystopia, first contact, hard science fiction that includes technology-accurate science fiction, time travel, space opera, not like musical operas, but like space, like almost like odysseys, like Star Wars and Star Trek count as a space opera, historical fantasy, mythological or fairy tale fantasy, swords, sorcery, and dragons, and juvenile easy reading science fiction and fantasy. All library purchases of fiction come from one source, Barnes & Noble at Ala Moana Center in Honolulu. I made an extensive use of Barnes & Noble's online research tool to select books. Since increasing the science fiction and fantasy collection is sourced by Barnes & Noble, the collection is limited to mainstream works as I would not be allowed to look at other vendors. Budget for the library is small, only receiving about $1,000 a year for the purchase of recreational books. Using pricing form from the Barnes & Noble's website, a Newark Public Library estimates that the average book would be about $10 to $20, considering if it's paperback or hardcover, which works out to roughly 50 to 100 books for purchase a year. The secondary sources, which I would consider donations, were not considered in the purchase as suggested by the librarian at WCF because they cannot request specific titles from donors. They get what is given to them. However, as stated previously, when it comes to selecting and weeding out donations, they must be scrutinized to determine if the material is appropriate and corresponds with core number 1460 and 1505. If it doesn't, then it's immediately weeded from the selection. So weeding continued. Weeding primary sources should only occur when books are damaged to the point that they are unreadable. However, secondary sources, as I mentioned before, it must be weeded immediately if they don't fit with Core 1416. And I've also included a new term here, self-weeding. This is a phrase that refers to the ongoing problem of theft in WCF library. And according to the librarian, about 30 recreational books go missing every month. Most common are the science fiction and fantasy. And it is reasonable to assume that no other type of library probably has such a high prevalence of book theft, such as correctional libraries, especially popular genres such as science fiction and fantasy. In most cases, the librarian and security will do a sweep of the modules to bring back any books for processing. Theft at WCF Library must be considered in any collection development strategy put forth and will alter the method by which a librarian develops the collection. For example, one must have backup copies of popular titles because it's always the popular titles that often go missing and might reappear 2 or 3 months later, or they might find it when they're doing a sweep of the modules. They're also likely to be damaged because of extensive use. Unfortunately, with such a small budget as outlined in this project, buying duplicate titles is not always practical. So the practice should be considered when it's possible. This is just a really simple diagram that I created for the weeding. It's like I said, if the material is extremely damaged to the point it can be read, then it must be discarded. And is the material appropriate in that? Does it fall under Core 1416? If it doesn't, no. And this is up to the discretion of the librarian, the director, and also the warden has a very big say too as well in the material. So in conclusion, developing a weeding and selection policy for WCF Library has been a very interesting experience for me. I've learned a lot from speaking with the WCF librarian. Additionally, much was available online in terms of establishing correctional library policy from the Department of Public Safety. But the simple fact regarding the selection process for WCF is to use common sense and above all follow the policy of Core 1416, which in detail explains what materials you can and cannot have. And that concludes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed learning about selection and weeding process for a correctional librarian. I look forward to discussions online.